Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover the tragic murder of an LGBTQ woman in Bangalore. In the bustling streets of Bangalore, where the vibrant mix of cultures and communities collide, the city seemed to carry an unspoken promise of inclusivity. But for Neha, a transgender woman who had bravely embraced her identity, life in the city was far from peaceful. Known for her kind heart and bold spirit, she had always been an advocate for LGBTQ rights, often seen at rallies and organizing events to support others in the community. Neha had become a symbol of resilience, speaking openly about the challenges faced by transgender individuals in a society that often shunned them. She had found her voice and was determined to make a difference, not just for herself but for everyone like her. However, Neha's visibility had attracted the attention of a local gang, notorious for their violent and discriminatory acts against marginalized groups. The gang's leader, a man named Karan, had long harbored a deep-seated hatred toward transgender individuals, seeing them as unnatural and a threat to his perception of social order. He believed that the presence of transgender people, especially those who were outspoken about their rights, challenged the values he held dear. His gang, composed of men from similar backgrounds, shared his views and were willing to go to great lengths to uphold them. The gang had become a powerful force in certain neighborhoods, known for their intimidation tactics and violent retribution against anyone they deemed different. Despite Neha's efforts to live her life unapologetically, her activism had begun to draw the gang's ire. Her involvement in public events, her social media posts advocating for transgender rights, and her unwavering stance on issues like equality and acceptance had made her a target. Karan and his followers were enraged by her refusal to hide or be silenced. To them, Neha represented everything they despised: defiance, individuality, and a refusal to conform to the rigid gender norms they held sacred. Their animosity toward her grew with each public appearance, and it wasn't long before they began to threaten her directly. In the days leading up to the attack, Neha began to notice small but unsettling signs. She received threatening messages from unknown accounts, and on more than one occasion she spotted unfamiliar faces lurking outside her apartment. The gang had always been discreet in their operations, but now they were becoming bolder, their intentions clear. Neha's friends urged her to take precautions, suggesting she change her routine or stay with them until the situation calmed down. But Neha refused. She would not let fear dictate her life. She believed in the power of visibility, in showing the world that transgender individuals deserved the same rights and respect as anyone else. Her resolve only grew stronger, even as the danger around her escalated. Then, one evening, Neha received an anonymous tip from someone within the community. The message was brief but chilling: "They're coming for you." Tonight it was from a trusted source, someone who had overheard talk of an ambush being planned by Karan and his gang. Her friends pleaded with her to go into hiding, but Neha, ever the fighter, refused to back down. She couldn't let her life be dictated by hate. She was determined to keep living her truth, no matter the cost. As she went about her day, preparing for an evening event that she had been looking forward to, a sense of dread settled in. Neha couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the threats or the strange occurrences, it was a deep, unsettling intuition. But she had learned to trust her gut, and tonight she couldn't ignore it. However, even with that sense of unease, she had no idea that the night ahead would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those who loved her. Days before the attack, Neha began noticing strange things. Her social media accounts, once a place for her to share her experiences and advocate for the LGBTQ community, were suddenly flooded with hateful comments and threats. Some of the messages were so vile they made her stomach turn, filled with slurs and graphic insults aimed at her identity. She had grown used to occasional online hostility, but the sheer volume of these messages made her realize that something was changing. It wasn't just a few trolls anymore, it was coordinated, deliberate harassment. And this time the threats seemed far more personal. In addition to the online abuse, Neha noticed that she was being followed. It started out subtly at first. She'd spot unfamiliar faces on her regular walks through the city, always at a distance but never far enough to make her feel comfortable. Sometimes it was the same person, always watching her from a street corner, their eyes fixed on her as she passed by. Other times it was a different face, but the intent seemed clear: someone was keeping tabs on her. The unsettling feeling grew each day, and she began to wonder whether the threats had escalated beyond just words. The feeling of being watched made her paranoid, but Nihei refused to let fear control her. She had already faced so much adversity in her life; this was just another challenge to overcome. Her activism and courage had earned her respect in the community, and she couldn't bear to stop now. But even as she walked through the crowded streets, surrounded by strangers who either ignored her or looked on with suspicion, she couldn't shake the sense that something darker was lurking on the horizon. There was no telling where the hate was coming from, but it was closing in, and it felt like a storm was about to break. Her friends noticed the change in her as well. They could see the weight of the anxiety on her face, the way she constantly looked over her shoulder as though expecting an attack. One evening, after a particularly harrowing day, Nihei confided in a close friend about her growing fears. She recounted the ominous messages and the feeling of being followed. Her friend urged her to take precautions, suggesting she vary her routines or even temporarily move to a different area. The community around her was supportive, but Nihei refused to accept that her life would be governed by fear. She couldn't let the hate win. Her determination to remain visible was tested the very next day, when she received a chilling phone call from a reliable source. The voice on the other end was shaky, urgent, and clearly fearful. Nihei listened intently as the person explained that they had overheard a conversation between members of Karen's gang. They were planning something big, something aimed directly at her. The tip was vague, but it was enough to make Nia's heart race. The gang was preparing for an attack. They had been watching her too, and now they were ready to strike. Her immediate instinct was to retreat. She had no illusions about how dangerous the situation had become. But even as she absorbed the gravity of the warning, Nihei's mind raced with thoughts of what it would mean to give in to fear. She had been an advocate for transgender rights for years, and the idea of stepping back now felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for. It would be a victory for the hate that had already taken so much from her community. She refused to run. She couldn't let the gang win. Not now, not ever. Instead, she decided to stay in the city and confront the growing threat head-on. The gang might have had the power to silence others, but Nihei would not be one of them. As much as the warning terrified her, she wasn't willing to let the forces of hatred dictate her actions. As evening fell and the city grew darker, Nihei felt a sharp tension in the air. She knew something was coming. Yet, despite her fear, she couldn't bring herself to leave the streets she had once felt so at home in. She had lived her truth, fought for the rights of people like her, and she would continue to do so. Whatever was waiting for her, she would face it head-on. What Nihei didn't know, however, was that the moment she took her first step onto the street that evening, she was walking straight into the waiting arms of danger. It was just after sunset when Nihei made her way down a quiet, dimly lit street near her apartment. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the city felt distant. The usual hustle and bustle of Bangalore had quieted down, but the occasional honking of cars and the chatter of street vendors reminded her that life continued around her. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her phone buzzed with messages of concern, but before she could respond, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally into the night. Nihei quickened her pace, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in her chest. She had walked this path countless times before, but tonight, the familiar surroundings felt foreign. Her heart pounded a little faster with every step, and the familiar noise of the city seemed muffled as she moved through the empty streets. It wasn't just paranoia; there was something different about tonight. The silence, the stillness, it felt as though the world itself had paused to watch her. A slight chill crept up her spine, but Nia pressed on. She couldn't afford to let fear take hold. She was nearly halfway home when she spotted something, or rather, someone standing at the far end of the street, near an abandoned shop front. At first, she thought it was just a passerby, another face among the many she had seen before. But as she drew closer, the figure didn't move. In fact, the person was staring directly at her. Something about the stillness of the figure made Nia's stomach turn. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to walk the other way. But Nia didn't allow herself to succumb to panic. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Her hand instinctively reached for the pepper spray she kept in her pocket, her fingers tightening around it for reassurance. She hadn't had to use it before, but tonight felt different. Something was about to happen. Suddenly, from behind, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were quick, purposeful, and growing louder. Nia's heart raced. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the street, trying to make sense of the situation. The footsteps were now accompanied by the low murmur of voices, muffled, but unmistakably close. Nia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the voices weren't just in one place, they were coming from all around her. They were closing in. Panic surged within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to make any sudden movements. The gang had been watching her for days, and now they were ready to act. She had been warned, but in that moment, the reality of it all felt like a punch to the gut. She was no longer an activist walking through the streets of her city, she was a target. Nia began walking faster, her footsteps quickening as the sound of the gang's approach grew louder. She couldn't see them yet, but she knew they were there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The figure she had seen earlier was now gone, swallowed by the darkness. She looked behind her again, only to see shadows moving swiftly through the alleyways. They were closing in on her, and there was nowhere to hide. Her phone buzzed once more with another urgent message, but Nia didn't have time to check it. The sense of danger was overwhelming, and her mind raced as she considered her options. She could run, but she knew she wouldn't make it far before they caught up with her. She could fight, but she was alone, and they were too many. Nia's thoughts raced, but there was no time for hesitation. The only choice she had now was to keep moving and hope for a chance to escape. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she moved faster down the street, her steps quick but deliberate. The sound of the gang's footsteps behind her was now unmistakable, and they were gaining on her. In the distance, she could make out the outline of a crowd, a group of people still out for the evening, but they were too far away to help. She had to keep moving. But just as she reached the corner of the street, she heard a voice, a command, sharp and clear. Stop! The sound of it echoed through the alleyway, and in that moment Nia knew there was no escape. She turned sharply, but before she could react, strong hands grabbed her from behind. The gang had caught up. The fight she had been preparing for had begun. As Nia's body was discovered the following morning, the city was rocked by shock and outrage. News outlets reported the attack as a random act of violence, a senseless crime committed by a group of faceless criminals. But for those who knew Nia, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a senseless killing. This was a hate-fueled act, a brutal manifestation of the anger and prejudice that had been festering beneath the surface of Bangalore for years. Her murder was a targeted attack, a deliberate attempt to silence someone who had dared to stand up for herself and others like her. At first, the police struggled to make sense of the crime. The lack of witnesses and the nature of the attack made it difficult to piece together what had really happened. The gang, knowing the gravity of what they had done, had quickly moved to cover their tracks. They destroyed any evidence linking them to Nia's death, burning clothes, erasing messages, and intimidating anyone who might have had information. They knew that the police would come searching, and they didn't want to be caught. The gang had always been good at covering their tracks, using fear and intimidation to keep the authorities at bay. But despite their best efforts, something about Nia's death felt different. The LGBTQ community in Bangalore, already reeling from the loss of one of their most vocal advocates, refused to let the crime go unnoticed. Friends of Neha, along with others who had been involved in her campaigns, began to speak out. They flooded social media with posts demanding justice, sharing photos of Neha and recounting her work for transgender rights. The hashtag Justice for Neha quickly went viral, becoming a rallying cry for those who wanted to see the killers brought to justice. Meanwhile, the police, under mounting pressure, began to piece together the puzzle. They interviewed neighbors, scoured the scene of the crime for any overlooked clues, and reviewed security footage from nearby shops. What they discovered was both shocking and horrifying. One of the last people to be seen near Neha was a known member of Karen's gang. The footage was grainy, but the figure was unmistakable. The police immediately began to focus their investigation on the gang, who had long been known for their violent tendencies. At the same time, Karen and his gang members went into full damage control mode. They spread rumors, trying to deflect suspicion and mislead the investigators. They claimed that the murder was the work of a rival gang, or that it was simply a case of a robbery gone wrong. The more they lied, the more the pressure mounted. The authorities, unwilling to be misled, began to dig deeper. They uncovered evidence of the gang's involvement in other violent acts, but nothing as brutal as the murder of Neha. The gang's history of targeting marginalized groups made them the prime suspects, but they had done everything they could to distance themselves from the crime. As the investigation continued, Neha's supporters rallied around her family and friends, offering their condolences and pledging to carry on the fight for justice. They attended protests, held vigils, and demanded that the police do more to protect those at risk of violence because of their gender identity. What started as a quiet, mournful march for Neha quickly grew into a movement. The tragedy of her death had sparked something in the city, a call to action that could not be ignored. People began to talk openly about the dangers faced by the transgender community in Bangalore, about the pervasive discrimination and violence that had gone unchecked for far too long. Still, the gang's cover-up continued. Karan and his followers were determined not to get caught, but they underestimated the power of the community that Neha had left behind. Her death, while tragic, had only made the fight for justice stronger. The investigation was no longer just about solving one murder. It had become a symbol of the broader struggle for equality and respect for all people, regardless of their gender identity. Despite the ongoing cover-up, the truth began to surface. As more people came forward, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The investigation, once stalled by lies and intimidation, started to gain momentum. And with each new lead, Neha's legacy grew stronger. She had been more than just a victim. She had become a beacon of hope for the LGBTQ community, a symbol of defiance against the forces of hatred and prejudice that had tried to silence her. As the investigation into Neha's murder unfolded, the weight of the community's anger and demand for justice grew heavier by the day. Neha's death had awakened something deep within the city, a call for accountability, for an end to the violence and discrimination that had been allowed to fester unchecked for so long. The protests intensified, filling the streets with people who carried Neha's image on placards and chanted for justice in the face of corruption and inaction. What had started as a quiet, personal tragedy was now a public rallying cry. For many, Neha had become more than a symbol of an individual's fight for identity. She was the face of a movement that demanded respect, dignity, and equality for all. Amidst the chaos, the police began to close in on Karen and his gang. The evidence against them was irrefutable, but even then, Karen refused to give up his power. The gang leader had been untouchable for years, using fear to maintain control over his territory. He was a master manipulator, and the idea of being caught and exposed filled him with fury. He tried to bribe officials, intimidate witnesses, and disrupt the investigation. His followers, many of whom had grown up under his rule, were just as eager to protect their leader. But with the pressure mounting, cracks began to form in their resolve. One by one, members of the gang started to turn on each other. It wasn't just the fear of the law or the possibility of a long prison sentence, it was the growing realization that Nihai's death wasn't just a tragedy for one person. It was a tragedy for the entire community. As witnesses came forward and the evidence began to mount, Karen's grip on his gang began to slip. Several members once loyal to him began to talk. Some out of fear, others out of guilt, but all of them knew the walls were closing in. In an unexpected twist, one of the gang members, a young man who had been with Karen for years, finally confessed. He told the police everything: how the gang had planned the attack on Nihai, how they had stalked her, how Karen had incited the violence. It was a crucial break in the case. And with it, the investigation shifted into full gear. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and soon, Karen and several of his gang members were arrested. The trial that followed was long and emotional. The courtroom became a battleground where the community fought for justice, and Karen's defense attorneys did everything in their power to shift blame and downplay the severity of the crime. But the voices of Nia's family, friends, and supporters could not be silenced. They testified about her life, her work, and the promise she had made to continue fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The prosecution presented a powerful case, painting a clear picture of a hate-driven attack orchestrated by Karen and his gang. It was impossible for the jury to deny the reality of what had happened. When the verdict came down, it was a moment of mixed emotions for Niha's supporters. Karan was sentenced to life in prison, and several of his followers received varying degrees of punishment for their roles in the crime. The relief was palpable, but it was tempered by the undeniable fact that Nihai was gone. No sentence could bring her back or undo the damage that had been done. But the trial had accomplished something far greater. It had brought attention to the issues faced by the transgender community, both in Bangalore and around the world. It had forced people to confront the truth about the violence, discrimination, and hatred that transgender individuals often face. Nia's death had sparked a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Her story became a turning point, a catalyst for change. Her supporters, though grieving, vowed to continue her work. They launched new initiatives to support LGBTQ rights, providing resources and safe spaces for those who felt alone or at risk. The city, though scarred by Nihai's death, began to change. Awareness campaigns and educational programs were implemented, and slowly the conversation about transgender rights started to gain ground. Nihai's death, while devastating, had not been in vain. Her legacy lived on, not just in the fight for justice but in the strength of the movement she had helped ignite. The world may have tried to silence her, but it had only made her voice louder. Nihai's story would never be forgotten. Her courage, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to her truth would continue to inspire future generations of advocates, fighters, and survivors. And in the end, that was the greatest justice of all.